What's up guys, Asian here again with another build video, and today we're going to be going over the Magicka Sorcerer. Specifically, this is going to be a pet build. So pet sorcs are still very strong in the Summerset Isles patch. They're probably second only to Magicka Nightblades, and potentially they beat out Magicka Wardens when they use the Bear Ultimate in terms of range DPS. So pet sorcs are still very strong. Of course, they do come with the downside that you must use a pet. So you won't be able to use a pet sorc for every single fight in the game, mainly because there are mechanics in certain fights that kind of are pet unfriendly. Good example would be the mage in Ethereal Archive, because the pet can spread chain lightning, and Zazhasha in Maw, because Zazhasha's pillar mechanic can actually kill pets. So even though the pet sorc is very powerful and can be used for most fights in the game, you still want to make sure to have a non-pet build as a backup in case of fights where you will not be able to use your pets at all. Now, just like the rest of our build videos, we'll be going over our gear, our skills, our attribute points. We'll talk about things like race, CPs, everything that you need to know about this build. We will discuss the rotation, kind of what's going on when we're going through the rotation, what you should prioritize, and kind of what the mentality is for creating the rotation as it currently is. And then we'll close things off with a 6 million dummy Parse, so you guys can compare the DPS that you can pull on a pet sorc to a non-pet sorc or other pet sorc builds or other ranged Magicka DPS. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started first with our gear. For our monster helm, we're going with 2-piece Ilambris. This comes from Crypt of Hearts 1. Ilambris is probably going to be the strongest monster helm for sorcs right now if you are playing at range. If you're playing at melee range, then you can go with Zaan instead. Zaan comes from Scalecaller Peak, so you will need Dragonbones DLC in order to get Zaan. But again, Zaan is only very powerful when in melee range. When you are outside of the Zaan proc radius of about 10 meters, then Zaan basically becomes useless. So we're going to assume that we're playing at range, because that's kind of the strength of the Magicka Sorcerer. So we're going to be going with Ilambris instead. You can go with Skoria instead if you would like. So Skoria here does come from City of Ash 2, so that is a little bit more difficult dungeon to complete. So that's kind of the downside of using Skoria. But Skoria and Ilambris both pull about the same DPS. Ilambris' strength really lies in if the boss doesn't move around as much, because the proc that Ilambris creates doesn't move around with the boss. Compare that to Skoria, which is a lot stronger in mobile fights because you're guaranteed to get that proc hit, compared to Ilambris, where the boss might move out of your proc and then you basically lose DPS that way. So depending on the type of fight that you have, you might want to use Skoria instead of Ilambris, so I like to carry both of them depending, and switch them out depending on the fight specifically. One thing with Skoria is, because you have a 1-piece max health effect, you can go with 2 Magicka enchants. With Ilambris, because the 1-piece is a max Magicka enchant, you will have to use a max health enchant on a pet build, just because you do want to get a little bit more health, because we are using Quicken's Potent Brew in order to help out our sustain. So that's something that you're going to want to take into consideration when you use Ilambris versus Skoria. For our 5-piece body pieces, we're going with Necropotence. Necropotence is still the tried and true best set for pet sorcs, mainly because pet damage scales off of max Magicka. Even though they did change how light attacks scale, they did not change how pets scale, so pets damage still scales off of primarily max Magicka. Doesn't scale very well with spell damage, so Necropotence is going to be very powerful. Not only does it help boost all of our abilities, but it boosts our pet damage, something that Julianos isn't able to do, because again, pets don't scale very well off of spell damage. And then for our other 5-piece, so we're going with Sororia. Sororia is a new set that is dropped from the Cloud Rest trial. I have the perfected version here, but you can go with the imperfect version. The difference between the perfect and imperfect set is the perfect set does have an additional max Magicka set bonus on that 5-piece, and imperfect set does not have that max Magicka bonus on the 5-piece. You do need to have 5 pieces of perfect Sororia in order to gain that additional max Magicka boost. If you have even 1 piece that is imperfect, then you will not get that max Magicka boost. That's something to keep in mind when you're picking out your set pieces for Sororia. So we do have the 3 jewelry pieces, and then we have an Inferno Staff of Skoria on our front bar here. So Skoria is only going to be active while we're on our front bar. On our back bar, we still have the Maelstrom Inferno Staff infused with a weapon damage enchant. Now we'll quickly go over our gear traits. All of our armor traits are going to be divines, and they all have max Magicka enchants. The exception is that we do need a max health enchant on one of our large pieces, so either the head, chest, or legs, and that's just so to ensure that we have pretty good health pool for survivability. Because we are using Witchmother's Potent Brew, so we are losing a little bit of health as a result of that compared to using blue food in exchange for some additional Magicka regen. For our jewelry traits, we're going with 1 Bloodthirsty and then 2 Arcane, and then for enchants we have 2 spell damage and 1 Magicka regen glyph. You can replace this regen glyph with a spell damage glyph. If you decide to do that, then I would recommend swapping out the flame damage glyph that we have here on our Inferno Staff front bar with an absorb Magicka glyph. Pet Sorcs, Magicka Sorcs in general, regardless of the build, generally have very poor Magicka sustain, and even though we are going to be using balance in order to help out our sustain, it's still really crappy. When we go over our combat metrics parse, after the 6 million dummy parse, you will see the kind of difference between regen versus drain on a Magicka Sorc, and you can kind of compare that to other Magicka DPS classes, and you'll find that Sorcs generally have one of the worst sustains out of the 5 classes in the game right now. So we are going with 1 Bloodthirsty instead of 3 Bloodthirsty, mainly because if you have 8 or 9 DPS running all 3 Bloodthirsty traits, you're going to get less return out of using Bloodthirsty. Basically the trade-off is Arcane will boost your damage throughout the entire fight versus our Bloodthirsty, which only increases your damage during the last 25% of the fight. So you kind of got to make that balance that way, and the best balance here is going to be 2 Arcane and then 1 Bloodthirsty. And then for our weapons, again, we have both of them are infused. We have a flame damage here because we do have that regen glyph on one of our jewelry pieces, but if you go 3 spell damage, then you can replace this with an absorb Magicka enchant to make up for that additional regen. Then we have the weapon damage enchant on our back bar, an infused Inferno Staff. You can go with Nirnhoned if you would like. I personally find that infused pulls a little bit ahead of Nirnhoned. Difference is pretty small overall. The kind of the takeaway behind using infused versus Nirnhoned is if you are on your back bar often enough, basically every 5 seconds or 6 seconds in order to proc the weapon damage enchant, then you're better off going with infused, just because the weapon damage enchant will carry over to your front bar, and it's going to obviously be a lot more potent with infused. Now if you are going to be sitting on your back bar, if you're going to be heavy attacking on your back bar, then Nirnhoned will actually be a little bit stronger than infused in this case, just because you are taking advantage of the additional spell damage on your back bar. But that's only if you're going to be lingering on your back bar for more than a couple of seconds. Otherwise, going infused, the weapon damage enchant is going to be stronger, especially because we have an Inferno Staff, so our heavy attacks are not very good with AoE damage. So we're going with infused instead. Now, instead of Skoria, you can go. There are a few sets that you can potentially use. The first set is going to be Mechanical Acuity. Mechanical Acuity is still fairly strong here, so definitely a good choice. Just again, make sure you have that Inferno Staff on the front bar, and then 3 jewelry pieces with the same traits and enchants. Now, if you don't have Acuity because you haven't managed to level your jewelry crafting up yet, then you can use Necropotence jewelry and then go with body pieces of Mechanical Acuity. Or you can go with Burning Spellweave. Burning Spellweave is going to be a pretty good choice here because we are going with double Inferno staves, so we will have fairly good uptime on Burning Spellweave. Again, Burning Spellweave drops from City of Ash, any of them, 1 or 2, so you can just farm it on 1. Again, make sure your enchants and your traits are pretty much the same, and you will need a Burning Spellweave Inferno Staff, so that's probably going to be the most difficult piece to get for Burning Spellweave, so you will just try to farm City of Ash 1 on normal and just blow through it. Just try to get that Inferno Staff. Bring a couple of friends who also need Burning Spellweave as well. Now we're going to go over our character sheet, so this is kind of miscellaneous stuff here. So race, I am a Breton. That's mainly because I am on the PTS right now, and I kind of want to make sure my PTS characters are as close to my live characters as I possibly can make them. So my Sorc on live is a Breton, so it's a Breton here. The two races that are going to be pretty much neck and neck when it comes to top DPS race is going to be the Altmer and the Dunmer, so the High Elves or the Dark Elves. The High Elves get 10% max Magicka, 9% Magicka regen, and then 4% additional Flame, Shock, and Frost damage. The Dunmer get 9% additional max Magicka, 6% max stamina, and then they get 7% additional flame damage and 2% additional shock and frost damage. So the Altmer have slightly better regen because they do have that 9% Magicka regen, and they have a little bit more shock damage versus the Dunmer, which have higher flame damage and they lose that regen as well as 1% max Magicka. Now if you're going with double Inferno staves, the Dunmer do push out just a little bit ahead of the Altmer, but if you have even one lightning stave, for example if you have a lightning staff back bar, then the Altmer are going to edge out Dunmer. The difference between them is still pretty close regardless if you're using double Inferno or double lightning, so you can pick whichever race suits your desires really. Bretons are kind of a third choice here. They get 10% max Magicka, 3960 spell resistance, so that helps out your survivability, and then they also get 3% cost reduction to their Magicka ability. So a little bit of help to sustain, but not quite as strong as the 9% additional Magicka regen from the Altmer. We have all of our points are going into Magicka here. We don't need to put any points into health, even with Witchmother's Potent Brew. You can see here with the pet additional health from the pet passive under the Daedric summoning line, and Witchmother sitting at about 17.5k health, which is plenty for most trials. Now if you do feel like you are dying too often or you feel like you need the additional health, then by all means shift a couple of points from Magicka into health. I wouldn't put any more than like 4 or 5 points into health. You just have to learn to anticipate mechanics and make sure to make liberal use of your shields. That'll definitely help out your survivability. So don't put any more than 4 or 5 points into health, because at that point I think you're, in my opinion, you're giving up a little bit too much max Magicka, giving up a little bit too much DPS in return for your survivability. Now for our Mundus Stone, we're going with the Apprentice here. You can go with the Lover instead. It's all going to be dependent on your penetration sets, your debuff sets. So if you don't have Alkosh, if none of your tanks are using Alkosh, then you might want to consider using the Lover. You might end up over penetrating by a little bit, anywhere between like 300 to 400, but overall it's going to be a little bit more beneficial to run the Lover instead of the Apprentice, because otherwise you will have to put a lot of points into spell erosion, so you will be losing DPS from shifting points out of your blue CPs. But if you do have Alkosh, then just go with the Apprentice instead. Even if you don't have Alkosh, Apprentice is still a pretty decent choice for Mundus Stone, but again, you will have to put a lot of points into spell erosion, so for me it's not really worth that trade-off. Then for food, we are using Witchmother's Potent Brew for that additional Magicka regen. We do lose some max Magicka and max health when compared to using blue food, but it's worth the trade-off for that additional Magicka regen. There is a slightly better version of Witchmother's Potent Brew called Clockwork Citrus Fillet that's made using Perfect Row. So as a result, as you can expect, it's going to be a little bit more expensive to use. It's probably around 2,500 or so per food item on PCNA, so it is kind of expensive to use, but Witchmother's is perfectly fine. It'll get you through pretty much all the content in the game, so don't feel like you have to use the Clockwork Citrus Fillet. Now for our skills. For our front bar here, we have Crystal Fragments, Elemental Weapon. You can go with Force Pulse or Crushing Shock instead. I just like Elemental Weapon because it does cost less Magicka, which does help out our sustain. We do lose the chance to proc Burning, Chilled, and Concussed with Force Pulse, but I prefer the trade-off, the sustain trade-off here. An Elemental Weapon can still apply Burning, Concussed, or Chilled. It's just one of the effects, and it's kind of at random. Then we have our pet. We have our Execute, Mage's Wrath, Inner Light, and then we have the Destro ulti. This is going to be used for fights where you need the additional AoE damage. It's also here in order to make sure we have Ancient Knowledge active while we're on our front bar. If you are using Force Pulse instead of Elemental Weapon, then you can swap Fiery Rage out for Shooting Star instead for the additional Magicka regen and max Magicka. For our back bar, we're going to be using Balance in order to help sustain ourselves. You can swap this out with Daedric Prey or Haunting Curse. It's kind of up to you. I tried out using Balance and using Haunting Curse / Daedric Prey, and I found the DPS difference to be pretty much like non-existent. There is a small difference, very, very small. It's like less than 500 DPS by using like Haunting Curse or Daedric Prey versus Balance. So we're just going to go with balance just because I prefer to have that additional source of sustain compared to an additional source of DPS. Sustain is very important in a lot of trial scenarios, a lot of PvE scenarios, because you do want to make sure your damage is capable of being sustained over long periods of time. And we have Liquid Lightning, we have the double slot our familiar, then we have Blockade, and this is where we put our shield, so you can go with either morph of Conjured Ward, Empowered Ward, or Hardened Ward. Hardened Ward will give you a stronger shield, but Empowered Ward will give you a shield that lasts for longer, it's slightly cheaper, and it also gives minor intellect to you and everybody around you, so that does help out your sustain a little bit. So I prefer to go with Empowered Ward. I do have uses for Hardened Ward depending on the content that I'm running, but overall I prefer Empowered Ward for the additional Magicka regen. But we will be using Elemental Drain instead, just for the 6-million dummy Parse. And then our primary single target ultimate is going to be the Greater Storm Atronach here. When you do drop it, just be mindful of where you're dropping it, because when it is unsummoned, basically when the timer runs out, you actually can't DPS through it, so just be mindful of where you're placing it. Also, you do want it to be somewhat close to the melee stack, so that way they're able to get that Major Berserk synergy from the Atronach. Now for our champion points, we have 250 points into each of the 3 different colors. So starting off with our green CPs, we have 75 into Arcanist and Tenacity, which leaves 100 points, which you can put into the remaining nodes however you would like. It all depends on your personal preference and which passives you want to get. So I like 40 into Shadow Ward, 31 into Tumbling, and then 28 into Warlord. But again, you can kind of split it up however you'd like, depending on which of these passives that you like. Now for our blue CPs, I do want to tell you again that I am optimized for Alkosh in group. If you don't have Alkosh in group and you are running the Lover, then you obviously might not need to put any points into Spell Erosion. If you don't have Alkosh and you are not running the Lover and using Apprentice instead, then you will need to put some points into Spell Erosion, much more than what I have here. So in that instance, you could drop Elfborn and Elemental Expert down to 56, take some points out of Staff Expert and put them into Spell Erosion until you hit the penetration cap. So just keep that in mind here. So if you do have Alkosh and you're running the Apprentice, your CP is going to look somewhat like this. 61 into Elfborn, 64 into Elemental Expert, 11 into Spell Erosion, 23 into Staff Expert, 40 into Master at Arm, and 51 into Thaumaturge. Now finally for our red CPs, so those of you guys who have followed my builds do know that I like to take a balanced approach when it comes to CPs, and then shift depending on the specific content that I'm running, so depending on the specific trial that you're going to run, you might need to kind of shift your CP points around in the red trees in order to kind of minimize the damage that you'll be taking. Each trial has its own sort of kind of distribution of damage. So for example, in Ethereal Archive and Maw, you're taking more magical damage compared to physical damage when you compare to like VSO, where you're taking more physical damage instead of magical damage. So you do need to shift some points around depending on that, and there will be a video, or there should be a video that kind of goes over the CP point distributions on your red CPs for those trials. So for the balanced approach, I go 66 into Ironclad, 56 into Thick Skin, 64 into Hardy, and Elemental Defender. Now, 2 nodes that I do want to quickly mention here is going to be Quick Recovery and Bastion. If you put 11 points into either one of these, you will hit the jump point and you will gain the Field Physician passive. So when you're resurrecting another player, your damage taken is reduced by 15%, and it does affect the damage that your shields take as well. So as a Magicka DPS, you will probably be the first person in order to res somebody, because you do have access to a shield, so you'll be able to absorb damage while you are resurrecting somebody. So it is useful to have this Field Physician passive, so that way your shield doesn't run out in the middle of a resurrection. So I like to take 11 points into Bastion or Quick Recovery, depending on which one I feel is more important. So for example, if I'm running Maw, I'll go for Quick Recovery, but if I'm doing something like AA or something, I might do Bastion instead. So it really doesn't really matter which one you go in, you put 11 points into, but I do like having that Field Physician passive as a Magicka DPS. So that is all of our build information. So now let's go ahead and talk about our rotation. So before we start our rotation, I will take off the pet just so it doesn't end up screwing up with our 6-man dummy Parse that we'll be doing later on. Starting off on our back bar, so obviously you should open up by making sure you have your potion active, and then use your ultimate. Start off with an ultimate, and then on your back bar, you always want to do Liquid Lightning and then Blockade. And the reason for that is that Liquid Lightning has a 10-second duration, Blockade has an 8-second duration. So by the time you need to reapply Liquid Lightning, your Blockade should be pretty much almost done. So it lines up very nicely. It basically results in sort of an 8-second rotation, so to speak. Now if we go the other way around, if you go with Blockade and then Liquid Lightning. So because Liquid Lightning has a longer duration than Blockade, when you have to reapply Blockade on your back bar, you have kind of an awkward 2 to 3 seconds remaining on Liquid Lightning. Which means you're going to basically end up in one of two things. Either your dots are going to be offset by a fair amount, making the rotation a little bit more dynamic, so basically it's going to be harder, not necessarily a less DPS, it's just you have to be a lot more mindful of when you're putting your dots down, or you can choose to overcast. Basically you cast it before the duration is entirely up, and that is a little bit of a hit to your sustain as a DPS. So you kind of want to make sure that you are going Liquid Lightning and then Blockade, just so that the dots end up lining up a little bit better. It's not necessarily wrong to go with Blockade and then Liquid Lightning, but it does end up complicating the rotation by a little bit, and we kind of want to make sure our rotation is basically as simple as possible, as much as we can. Then, so we start off with Liquid Lightning and Blockade. We swap to our front bar, and then I like to do Pet Pulse on my front bar, so I have an extra chance at a Crystal Frag procs. And then I like to use Balance every rotation. And you can see here, as soon as I get my Crystal Frag procs, I'm basically using it right away. So that way I'm not like sitting on my frag proc, so to speak. And that's it's pretty important. Now if you happen to get a proc here, there's basically two things that you can do. Some DPS will use the proc, kind of have a little bit of downtime on their dots. Other people will finish their back bar rotation, so they'll lay down your dots. Then when they swap to your front bar, they'll use the Crystal Frag proc right away. The most important thing to just keep in mind when you have a Crystal Frag proc is to use it as soon as you can, because otherwise you might end up wasting the proc. So if I just keep on using Elemental Weapon and don't use my Crystal Frag procs, eventually it's either going to run out and then I lose the frag proc, or I can get a second frag proc which basically eats my first frag proc. So it's basically a quote-unquote wasted proc. So whenever you have your Crystal Frag proc, make sure to get rid of it as soon as you can. That way you're basically opening yourself up for another proc, and you're not wasting or sitting on a proc for too long. And so we do want to activate the pet on our front bar, so we have an additional chance of getting a Crystal Frag proc. Because we both have Inferno stabs on both of our bars, doesn't really matter which bar we activate the pet pulse in terms of the damage, but it is useful to have it to kind of remember, just do it on your front bar so you have that extra chance at a Crystal Frag proc. So in terms of execute phase, some people like to drop their pet pulse, other people do not drop their pet pulse at all. I try to keep pet pulse up, but sometimes I forget to do it. So you always want to make sure you have Liquid Lightning and Blockade down, and then you just spam Mage's Fury instead of Elemental Weapon or Force Pulse. Then you do want to try to keep your pet pulse up if you can. Now if you do get a frag proc, I don't recommend hitting it. You should hit it, I believe it's every 20 seconds for the minor prophecy buff, but you don't need to necessarily use it all the time. So during execute, you can use frag procs, but I would probably use no more than one on the bar at a time, because you do want to use as many uses of Mage's Fury as you can. You don't want to necessarily waste time with the frag proc. So if you take a look at, I'm not sure if you'll see the cast bar here. And you get a proc first. So you can see on the cast bar that there is sort of a cast time associated with Crystal Frags. So you know that's why you don't want to use too many Crystal Frags during execute, because then you're missing out on an additional Mage's Wrath instead, which will typically do more damage than Crystal Frags does. Partly because it is an execute, so it does do bonus damage, but also because Mage's Wrath does have a chance of proccing Implosion. It's a very small chance, a 6% chance, but every little bit of additional damage does help. But Crystal Frags does not have a chance of proccing Implosion, so we do want to keep on spamming Mage's Wrath as much as we can during Execute. But again, we do want to make sure we are hitting Crystal Frags every 20 seconds, so we do get that Minor Prophecy buff. Alright, so now that we've finished kind of talking about our rotation, let's go ahead and get started with the 6 million dummy Parse. So just a disclaimer here, I am not as familiar with a non-pet build as I am, I'm not familiar with a pet build as I am with a non-pet build. I tend to play non-pet builds on my Sorcs. I generally do not like playing pet builds on my Magicka Sorc. So my DPS here is definitely going to end up being lower than what a more seasoned pet Sorc will be able to pull. So that's kind of my disclaimer for this Parse here. Another thing to keep in mind too is that while we do have Major Breach, we don't have any source of Minor Berserk or anything like that. So if you want to compare this to like a Magicka Warden using Bird of Prey or Magicka Nightblade, do keep in mind that they do have access to Minor Berserk, so their parses are going to be a little bit higher overall. So that's just something to keep in mind if you do want to compare parses to Magicka Nightblade or Magicka Warden that's using Bird of Prey. So let's go ahead and get started. I will try to narrate throughout the Parse so you guys get a sense of what's going on. We will open up with our ultimate. So one thing that I failed to mention while I was talking about our rotation is because we have Skoria active on our front bar, Skoria procs on single target direct damage effects. So that's basically going to be Crystal Frags, Elemental Weapon, and I don't believe it procs on your light attacks. I could be wrong on that. And the buff, the circle itself lasts for 10 seconds. So if you are going to be heavy attacking on your back bar, just be mindful of when you're timing your heavy attack, because the buff from Skoria lasts for 5 seconds. So you do want to time it so that way you're not on your back bar for longer than 5 seconds, so that way you don't lose your Skoria stacks. So in terms of using balance, while this does end up losing health, in a trial scenario you will have a healer healing you, so it's not that big of a deal if you're using balance. In a solo Parse, where you're not necessarily getting healed, it does make a little bit of a difference. Sorcs do get some additional health back when they use dark magic ability, so that would be Crystal Frags. So we do have a little bit of a heal built in, but it is kind of RNG dependent because it does rely on getting those frag procs. Gotta hit our Crystal Frag so that way we maintain our Minor Prophecy buff. And there we go, that is our pet Parse. Again, a lot of pets, I'm not the best pet Sorc, so this Parse is relatively low compared to some other pet Sorcs that I've seen. So 36.4. If you guys have seen my non-pet video, then you'll know that I pull higher on a non-pet than a pet. And again, that is associated with my relative infamiliarity with the pet build overall. Again, I tend to play non-pet, not really a pet build kind of person here. So really quick, going through our Parse very quickly here. So you can see here, Skoria, we got 87% uptime. Again, Sorcerer is very good when you're kind of in a stack and burn where you don't have to move around a lot. Even in mobile fights though, as long as you're able to touch the circle every 5 seconds, you'll be able to maintain pretty good uptime on the Sorcerer buff. There are certain fights where Sorcerer is not going to be as strong. Off the top of my head, there's Hasha, the Twins, and Rakat and Maw. Basically all the boss fights in Maw, Sorcerer is not going to be as strong. Just because of the mechanics, you're moving around a lot. But for even things like Asylum and Cloud Rest, as long as you're kind of mindful of your Sorcerer proc, kind of the timing behind it, you are able to maintain pretty good uptime on the max stack of Sorcerer. I believe DJ Muzzleboy managed to get 60% uptime on the max Sorcerer buff in Cloud Rest, so it is possible to do. You just need to be very mindful of that proc. So you can see here that in terms of DPS, Liquid Lightning, Blockade, very high up here. You can see we didn't really let that drop too much, which is good. So you always want to make sure the number of hits you get from Liquid Lightning and Blockade are more or less equal to the number of seconds. So 167 to 165, 162 to 165, so we didn't let it drop off all too much. And then for light attacks, in terms of seeing whether or not your weaving is very good or not, basically take the number of hits you have, divide by the next seconds that you are in combat, and that'll give you a number between 0 and 1 basically. So in this parse, I have 147 divided by 165, and that gives me a ratio of 0.89. So pretty good light weaving. I could probably do a little bit better, but Magicka Sorcerer, especially if you're using crystal frags, will have a little bit lower overall ratio overall. So you kind of want to try to hit 0.9 if you can. That's basically your weaving. You're not missing any weaves at 0.9 or higher. Between 0.8 and 0.9, you are missing a couple of weaves, but overall your weaving is pretty much really good. Anywhere from 0.7 to 0.8, you're missing enough weaves that it's going to make a big difference on your DPS, so you should probably work on your weaving a little bit more. Then anything below 0.7 is you're missing too many weaves. You should work on light weaving more often in order to make sure you're making the most out of the VMA staff enchant as well as your light attack. As you can see here, light attacks make up a very, very large proportion of your DPS, almost 25% of your DPS. You can see here, Patch, Crystal Frags, Ellie Weapon, those are all up here, and then Atronach does a pretty good amount of DPS as well. So that is pretty much it for this build video. So in terms of Burning Spellweave compared to Sorcerer, Burning Spellweave pulls about the same as from my testing. You know, it's a little bit lower, but not by too much. And Acuity again is very similar, maybe like 100 to 100 DPS difference, lower or higher. It's close enough that you can pretty much chalk it up to user error and kind of within margin of error with the RNG with crits and stuff. So you can use Burning Spellweave, Acuity, or Sorcerer, and you'll be perfectly fine. One thing to take note of here in this part that I just noticed is the number of crits that we have is pretty low, 36.1% crits compared to our mean of 44.9. So that might explain why this parse was a little bit on the lower side. I have gotten up to 37k before, 37.2k I think was my highest. So that's it for this build video. I hope you guys found this informative. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them down in the comment section below. I will try to get back to them as quickly as I can. And I will see you guys in the next dungeon.